Right now, this is Chile. This is beautiful. The other day I showed the symphony being played. Millions of people coming out in Santiago, Chile. That's amazing. That is a mass uprising of the public, annoyed and pissed off by not just the history of the country and the rule set that has been in place that allowed the country to be that way, meaning Pinochet. The U.S., well, I'll talk about that in the secondary point, but the government, for the most part, the restrictions, especially on your ability to organize and those things, come from a different era. The Pinochet era, who was essentially a thug of the United States that was put into that particular office as a right-winger to tamp down and get rid of the lefty, if I'm not mistaken, Allende. They are trying to get new rights in Chile, not to mention neoliberal policies that have created massive amounts of income inequality. This is amazing. Chile is not the only place on fire. Iraq, I think Ecuador was on fire recently. Argentina just put in a left-wing government. Honduras, Haiti, Hong Kong, but also Bolivia. Now, Bolivia has just had an election. This is a mass showing of support for the government of Bolivia. Evo Morales, lefty, wins the election. He wins the election. But the right wing in the country, kind of like in Venezuela, wouldn't concede, despite him winning the election, and scream, there were abnormalities. Just like in Venezuela, when Guaido screamed, there were abnormalities. And the OAS, essentially a tool of U.S. foreign policy, puts out without zero evidence that there were abnormalities in the vote total. There was no evidence for this. And yet the papers parroted this as if this organization was some kind of fighter for human rights and not a tool of U.S. foreign policy. The right wing in Bolivia is initiating
Boliviano y al mundo entero debe saber
the government of
cómo
Bolivia
grupos que conspiran
is saying as much. Evo Morales, he is the rightful president of Bolivia. The right wing is not conceding the election. Whether or not they have help from the United States or not is unclear. It is clear that the U.S. has taken a tack in order to knock down left-wing governments or lefty governments. Morales, in no way, can be called brutal, can be called a dictator, can be called none of that nonsense. He won. They don't want to concede. And I set the point that in the same way that Guaido was working with the United States in order to try to take power forcefully if necessary, the fact that the U.S. would even broker such a deal to intrude into the politics of another nation like that gives incentive for a right wing that is low in morality, low in this notion of sovereignty of Bolivia itself, to try to use U.S. help to take power in this way, knowing that it will get U.S. backing in doing so. This is a coup, an outright coup, and they're using the term. Right-wing gangs have taken to outright violence. This woman was a politician. She was dragged out of her office, forced to sign a paper calling for the resignation, and doused with paint, threatened, beaten. The military, television offices were also attacked and raided. And supporters of the counter-revolutionaries, essentially a plutocratic class, because that's what this is, a counter-revolutionary action. Morales is a lefty. It's right-wingers that are trying to take power and not conceding. It's right-wingers that have been raiding these places and attacking these places and attacking these various people. The military has come out saying that they would defend Bolivia. We are forcefully united. We are fully united. always attached to discipline, order, and respect for the Constitution as guardians of the defense, security, and stability of the state. We'll never be at odds with the people. Paraphrase of the written statement. One last point. It was reported that some police stations had switched sides. Basically, the right wing doesn't want to concede the election. This is CEFRA, Center for Economic Policy and Research. No evidence that Bolivia election results were affected by irregularities of fraud or statistical analysis show. Statistical analysis of election results and tally sheets from Bolivia October 20th election shows no evidence that irregularities or fraud affected the official results that gave President Evo Morales a first-round victory, researchers and analysts at the Center for Economic and Policy Research say. Contrary to a post-election narrative that was supported without evidence by the OAS Electoral Observation Mission, statistical analysis shows it was predictable that Morales will obtain the first-round win based on the results of the first 83.85% of votes in a rapid count that showed Morales leading the frontrunner Carlos Mesia by less than 10 points. Meaning, he won. They just don't want to concede. Look, our myths are breaking down. That is true in the Democratic Party when I point that out, when the Republican Party... Let me say it this way. How do you get 300 million people to fall in line? How do you get 300 million people to fall in line? Meaning, I don't know what's going on in California right now. And yet, all of us are under the banner of the United States. It's laws, it's government, it's myth. It's your ability to believe unreal things that allows all of us to see ourselves as Americans. Ultimately, you're really just a person. As a man, you have a penis, she has a vagina, that's all you are. The labels that we apply to ourselves are something different. I hope you understand the difference in those things. One is real, the other one is not. It's somewhat of a legal fiction. Even your perception of yourself to some degree is always dodgy. My point is, us in this country, under this banner, have an adversarial process between one side, meaning the Democratic Party, Republican Party. We have a two-party system. We go after the Soviet Union because they were a one-party system, but we have two, so that makes us exceptional. How do you keep people who are in an adversarial process from not going so far beyond that adversarial process that they care less about the mantle of whatever state that they're in and care more about just taking power? It's the myths that allow you to do that. When those myths start breaking down and people start looking at it as I care more about power than anything else, including the sovereignty of the country itself. You get Venezuela. You also get Bolivia. What's taking place right now? I made the argument that that's true in the United States too, by the way. But this is more pernicious. They're threatening people at television stations and force them to change the programming. Morales, despite winning this election, has come out and said that he would have a second election, meaning they would have a new election. The OAS is a tool of U.S. foreign policy. Don't get it twisted. And people pretend that that's not true. That is entirely true. They come out and give a dodgy result on the election results. And he, indigenous, wins, now has to call a second election in order to try to push down a counter-revolutionary coup. Why do I call it counter-revolutionary? Ultimately, he's a lefty. And he put through various reforms to benefit the majority of the country itself. The right-wingers don't like it. And the right-wingers looks at this as an opportunity, I would imagine, based on what was taking place in Venezuela and knowing that Trump would be behind him and that these other patsy nations will be behind him in South America, take the opportunity to go after him. This is disturbing. It's gangster. It's the law of the jungle from the standpoint of international politics. He won in the first round, now has to have a second election. And all elections are to some degree a risk. Especially now that they're having a second election on top of this. Meaning they didn't accept the first election result. What makes you think they would accept the second? Or for that matter, do something in order to affect the result in a way that you lose? They're trying to coup in Bolivia. Bernie Sanders, beware. And I'll end it after this. The United States has taken action all across the world, meaning the government of the United States, specifically clandestine operations run by the CIA, either in the Middle East, either Southeast Asia, or in South America. This goes to bombing cars of military generals that wouldn't toe the line. This goes to propaganda that was issued all throughout these various countries in South America, be it Guatemala, be it Chile, and if I'm not mistaken, Honduras. But also military coups, like outright coups, where dictators, strongmen, will knock down the government, backed by us, thugs and gangs, people that are roving the streets, just like in Bolivia right now, El Salvador, to try to take down the government. Militarily, knock it down. In Chile, everything that's going on right now. Back a while ago, Chile was under the dictatorship of Pinochet, essentially a junta. Pinochet was our thug. Pinochet was brutal and vicious, our thug. Pinochet would have eventually toppled, but I'm making the point that we were doing this from the standpoint of our foreign policy in the various nations in order to prevent left-wing governments from taking power. The notion of the domino theory, this nonsense. If one government becomes a lefty, then all of them become lefties. Not to mention you had propaganda that was put forth from the fruit company to the president to make them think that these governments in South America, which were social democrats, were somehow communist governments. In which case, set for regime change brutally and repressively because there was an element of racism in the policies itself in the way that they were looked at the population. What happens? Tell me, what happens when it's not one of the smaller countries that is making a change from the standpoint of a person who calls himself a socialist, but it's the US itself? Meaning the nation that was funding this stuff, that was funding potentially what is taking place in Bolivia right now, that is funding what took place in Honduras, that is funding what was taking place in Venezuela, El Salvador, these countries. What happens when it's not the country that's funding it, but it's the country itself? Meaning we're not funding a smaller country going through these changes. It is us that is putting in a social democrat, or democratic socialist as he calls himself. What is the response from moneyed interests? In the same way that moneyed interests then sit back here in Bolivia and allow that to ride, will they allow a Sanders presidency to ride? And what would be the response of a Sanders presidency? And I don't think you should take this question lightly. This is not... Sanders is talking about a massive redistribution of wealth. The last major redistribution of wealth was done by a war, and that was done also for property. In this case, property being slaves, human beings. I am making the point that will there be a reaction to Sanders pushing through the policies that he's trying to push through? There may be a situation where the stock market tanks, which I strongly suspect will happen. If wages go up, there would definitely be this notion of the stock market being angry. You might have capital protests or strike. Like, there may be certain reactions that take place, but I would imagine that Sanders has to think in his head about all this stuff, because all of this stuff is predictable if he takes office and tries to enact the reforms that he is trying to take. Whether or not we have anything to do with what is taking place in Bolivia right now, I don't know as a flat fact. I would suspect, I wouldn't be shocked in the least, even as from the standpoint of the right wing believing that the United States will help it out and assist it in trying to take down this president. But I am concerned about what it means for us in the United States if a lefty gets in office and tries to enact the policies that he wants to enact. And will the right, meaning the moneyed interests in this case, the billionaire class, accept it? Don't take that question lightly. Like, share, subscribe. Think so.